All right, good morning and welcome to Our Homes, Ending the Housing Crisis. We're very pleased today to be joined by a special guest all the way from San Francisco, California. His name is Hans Hao. He is the appointed member of the Housing Stability Fund Oversight Board, a public body formed to provide oversight on city funds for the creation of social housing in the city and county of San Francisco. He's also served as board treasurer for the San Francisco Community Land Trust, where he facilitated the creation of the largest limited equity housing co-op in San Francisco. His career spans the intersection of affordable housing finance, policy reform, and civic engagement focused on increasing the supply of housing across all income levels in some of the most housing-challenged cities across the United States. And his day job is a program manager for housing initiatives at Meta, formerly known as Facebook. So welcome, Hans Hao. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here.
All right, so we understand you have a presentation, so feel free to take it away.
Yes. I will share my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in today to listen to some of the exciting social housing proposals that we have seen here in San Francisco. I guess to start, to level the playing field, because social housing is defined, differently at the state level as well as at the city level. We have specific legislation here in San Francisco that defines social housing as meeting two different criteria. First is who owns social housing. It has to be the city, a nonprofit, residents, or residents association, in ensuring permanent long-term affordability. And the second criteria is the AMI level, where social housing should serve all income qualified households with a maximum average of not more than 80% median income. And I think the most common form of social housing that we all are familiar with is municipal housing, so public housing in the US. But under this definition, it also includes nonprofit owned housing, as well as other entities like community land trusts and limited equity housing co-op. Here's a brief history of how social housing initiatives gain momentum here in San Francisco. So back in November 2020, we have two different local ballot measures. One is called Proposition I, which charges higher taxes on real estate transactions above $10 million. And the second ballot measure, Proposition K, authorizes the city to build affordable housing for up to 10,000 units. So both of these propositions passed in 2020 by San Francisco voters, and the city then approved a fund that will be funded by taxes collected from Prop I to support the development and creation of social housing. And the Housing Stability Fund Oversight Board, which is the public body that Senator Chang mentioned, which I've been appointed to, was then formed to provide recommendations on how we should use taxpayers' dollars to create social housing here in the city. So earlier this year, we did a public RFP process, received a ton of proposals from different stakeholders, and managed to get the city to approve almost $150 million of funding for social housing. And for the next few slides, I'll talk about some of the proposals that I have summarized. So when it comes to social housing in San Francisco, it plays a role not just in increasing housing production, but also in preservation. In San Francisco, we have a very robust acquisition and preservation program. A vast majority of San Francisco residents are renters, and many put at increasing risk of being displaced, as we have seen an increasing number of apartment buildings that are coming up for sale over the course of the pandemic. And our city's preservation program plays an important anti-displacement role and acts as a final stopgap measure to prevent displacement of the most vulnerable residents. And we have seen a temporary dip in sale prices in apartment buildings here in San Francisco, unlike other major cities like New York City, which has seen rent prices returning to pre-pandemic levels. I think San Francisco's recovery is still lagging, and there is a unique opportunity for nonprofits to buy buildings at less inflated prices and maintain affordability for long-time residents. Another form of social housing that is focused on preservation is a community land trust. A CLT is incorporated as a 501c3 nonprofit with a board made up of mostly residents and community members. And San Francisco Community Land Trust is one of the largest land trusts in the country. And what they do is they buy properties in really expensive areas like San Francisco. And one of the inputs of development costs for a building is land. The land is hard to come by and it's very expensive in San Francisco. So a CLT will then buy the property, separate the land from the building, and lease the building out to co-ops of tenants to make them permanently affordable. And this is known as a ground lease model, where the land trust will own the title of the land, while the title of the building belongs to homeowners who can sell their home according to a resale formula that I will speak about later on. And CLT is an important social housing model in San Francisco. As you can see, based on the statistics, 73% of the land trust residents have incomes below 80% AMI, and half are below 60% AMI. Next, I will talk about a case study on what a land trust could do. And 285 Turk is a recent acquisition of an apartment building in the Tenderloin district to preserve 40 units of affordable housing. Most of the residents are BIPOC residents. And I wanted to point out this example because I worked on the financing of this project for the land trust. And most of the time, land trust has to depend on subsidies from the government to finance purchase of buildings. But in this case, there is no subsidy at all from city, state, or federal government. Zero public dollars. The financing is mostly loans from Mission Aligned Credit Union, as well as other, I think, interesting and creative forms of financing. There was a crowdfunding campaign and different forms of impact investments from Mission Aligned institutions. And the intention of the land trust is to work with tenants of this building to form a limited equity housing co-op so that they can have ownership in their current home. So what is a limited equity housing co-op? So the LEHC model is a home ownership model in which a group of residents each buy a share in a development rather than an individual unit. And each share that they buy represents an entitlement or right to occupy a particular unit in a multi-unit building. One caveat for homeowners to buy the share is that their sale prices have to follow a resale formula that limits the amount of appreciation they should be expecting every year, which is why the model is called limited equity, because homeowners do gain equity over time, but the amount of appreciation they are getting on the equity is more limited, from 1% to 3% on average. It follows, an index of a consumer price index. So it requires residents to think about home ownership less as a wealth accumulation tool, but as a way for them and their families and the future generations to be able to continue to stay in place in the same building. And this is another case study of, I think, one of the earliest limited equity housing co-ops here in San Francisco. So in Chinatown. So the Chinatown in San Francisco is actually the oldest Chinatown in the US. And because of that, there are multiple generations of Chinese immigrants who have found refuge in Chinatown and have lived in many SRO buildings for multiple generations. And this building in particular, Columbus United Cooperative, CUC, had a group of mostly Chinese tenants organizing to be able to stay in place when the building was up for sale. And what happened was the land trust then came in to buy the building and work with the tenants to form a limited equity housing co-op, where under a ground lease model where the land trust owns the land and leases the land with a 99-year ground lease to the residents. And this model could work sustainably because the land trust provided technical assistance to the residents, giving them the kind of financial education required to understand what it takes or what it means to be a homeowner, how residents can save money to be able to pay monthly fees to cover maintenance. So all of that happened within a 3-year period, after which the building achieved financial stability. So I've talked about different social housing proposals that were focused on preservation, and now I'll pivot to production. Land acquisition is one of the main strategies for the city to be able to get access to public lands to build public or social housing. And I will sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about what are the different kinds of land that are available for the city or even the state to be able to acquire. And in California, the state actually controls almost 3 million acres of state, county, or city land, similar in size to LA County. And those lands, those excess surplus lands are not being utilized to their full potential, and they represent a potential to build long-term permanent affordable housing on them, especially when they are public land that are intended for public good. The second source of land is transit-oriented land that are owned by transit agencies like the Bay Area Regional Transit and Caltrain. Again, there are 250 acres of land just around the 4 Bay Area counties with a potential for 20,000 units of housing. And the third source of land, lands owned by school districts. I think there is a serious problem of talent retention for school districts across the state. Many teachers are not able to afford housing within the district that they serve in. And this is another way to find school district-owned land with a potential to develop teacher housing. So focusing specifically on teacher housing, we have received proposals from different teacher unions and teacher groups that came up with a proposal to acquire school district land to develop co-op housing. Average starting salary for a teacher between $43,000 and $65,000 a year, and 80% AMI in San Francisco is around $78,000. So most teachers who are starting out actually fall, below 80% AMI and do qualify for affordable housing. But currently, there's a huge wait list for all of the affordable housing projects that are up and running. And this is a proposal to build teacher housing that's dedicated to teachers so that the state and the city could facilitate recruitment and retention of teachers so that they don't have to commute from other regions to the districts that they serve in. This is the fourth source of sites or lands to build affordable housing. We received an interesting proposal from a city council member on the west side of San Francisco that proposed Yigby, yes, in God's backyard. He has found that there are underutilized church sites in his district that represent large potential to be used for affordable housing. Before the advent of mega churches and the internet, there are small neighborhood churches that really grew, especially on the west side of the city, where it's consisting mostly of single family neighborhoods. And right now that there are conversations that church leaders are having with local nonprofits to potentially reuse the church sites to build affordable housing dedicated to the most vulnerable members of our city, whether it is seniors or transitional age youth existing in the criminal justice system. Other potential sites that we considered, privately owned sites that require funding and unable to get funding from private sector to build housing. I think it's not a potential, even though they tend to be more expensive than public lands. There are parking lots that are not being utilized effectively, and more recently, commercially zoned lands. And I'll point out AB 2011, which is a state housing bill passed by Assemblymember Wicks that allows for by right approval for affordable housing on commercially zoned lands. So lands that are zoned for office and retail can now have affordable housing approved on those lands. And with the pandemic and the rise in remote working and the change in which companies approach their office space, there has been increased interest in looking at existing office space that are staying vacant and looking into feasibility on office conversions into housing. That represents another source of potential sites once more feasibility is done to see if there's any potential for a nonprofit developer to be able to convert office to housing. Next, I'll talk about the crux of the social housing program in San Francisco, which is municipal or public housing. And as you know, in the US, there has been a divestment of public housing funding that because due to changing administrations that made funding of public housing to be very volatile over time. But we have examples and famous examples in Vietnam and Singapore where that is not the case. And for a social housing program to be able to work in San Francisco, we had to pass Prop K in 2020 to authorize the city to be able to develop and operate up to 10,000 units of housing. And this is because in California's constitution, we have a provision called Article 34, which requires voter approval before public housing can be built in a community since the 1950s. And I think that Article 34 has caused low-income housing construction in California to be stymied for decades, and Prop K is a short-term solution to allow the city to be able to at least build up to 10,000 units without going back to the voter. Right now, at the state level, there are efforts to repeal Article 34, and there is actually a ballot measure that will come in 2024 that intends to repeal Article 34 that will come before California voters. So these are some of the characteristics of a public social housing program. One of the proposals we received from community groups is the need to create a municipally run housing agency. This housing program requires housing to be publicly owned and operated across all income levels. So using the mixed income model is key to the success of this program because the portfolio is supposed to be self-sustaining with average households earning less than 80% AMI. And another key tenet of social housing program is being able to have community and resident input through resident associations, as well as elevating the levels of sustainability in the built environment. Because many times when housing is built by the private sector with a shorter term time horizon for the investment, installing solar panels and other sustainability initiatives might require a longer payback period that private developer might not be incentivized to implement. I think this is where the public sector can really institute a higher level of sustainability. As we increase housing production, we have to think more carefully about making sure that the housing that we produce is climate resilient and minimize carbon emissions. The last category of proposals I'll go over hard to find housing categories that are often overlooked by the private sector. So there are state and federal affordable housing programs that have been insufficiently funded and overly prescriptive that create special challenges to develop new affordable housing, also improve existing housing for many San Francisco residents. State funding priorities have excluded many rapidly changing neighborhoods and failed to fund smaller sites in different neighborhoods that tend to be overlooked by private developers. At the same time, there are non-LIHTC housing projects that haven't been able to secure LIHTC funding because LIHTC, the tax credit program has become increasingly competitive and hard to get, especially here in California. And many of those projects remain unfunded. I think social housing funding could come in to really jumpstart those programs and make sure that they continue to move forward. And then lastly, some of our city's highest need populations, especially our seniors, live in single occupancy hotels that tend to be ignored by state and federal funding. So social housing, the social housing program could pay more close attention to potentially funding upgrades, repairs of existing public housing to make sure that our most vulnerable residents have access to basic standards of living within their buildings. So after going through all the proposals and all of the work that elected officials, housing groups, and housing advocates have done in the past few years to make sure social housing gains momentum in the city. And one of the reasons why I think social housing is becoming more important at this point in time and going forward is because private capital is likely to pull back in downturns. As someone who has had different careers in the private sector, trying to harness private capital into affordable housing, I've seen this happen historically, and it's likely to happen again in the near future, where private capital for affordable housing is not going to expand and it's likely going to shrink. And I think because of that, we, with the housing goals that remained ambitious and challenging before us, we cannot rely solely on the private markets to finance housing. And we have to start thinking about providing housing as a public or social good for the government to play a larger role in providing housing. Because of that, we need consistent long-term funding from governments at all levels to start. And we have managed to gain some success in getting some funding, at least locally here in San Francisco. However, funding has to come along with a series of policy reforms that make it easier, cheaper, and faster to build to make social housing sustainable. Because when construction costs are reaching close to $1 million a unit in some cases in San Francisco, the amount of funding that we are raising is not going to be sufficient to result in a meaningful number of units at the end of the day if you have to spend a lot of dollars per unit. So important to talk about policy reforms that need to come along with funding social housing. Some of these policy reforms are typical reforms that many pro-housing advocates have been advocating for years. Reforms to remove single-family zoning, finding ways to streamline approval and permitting for affordable housing projects, and back to increasing funding by governments at all levels and expanding subsidy sources at all levels, and having cities to really commit to prioritizing housing in their annual budgets. And this is probably unique to San Francisco, but I think we need to start to have a citywide and statewide approach towards increasing housing production. City and county of San Francisco consists of 11 different districts, and the amount of new housing development tend to be concentrated in very few districts. And with the housing element update work that we are currently going through, there has to be a more equitable way to increase housing production in every single district in the city, as well as every city has to produce its fair share of housing for the state. And the final, I think, attention that has to be paid is to expand capacity for existing builders. I think we can advocate for more funding for housing. We can make it easier, cheaper, and faster to build. But then we have to expand capacity of existing builders, people who are actually building the housing, especially those who focus on strictly on affordable housing projects. And historically, there are many systemic reasons that have prevented underrepresented developers and builders from getting access to capital. Traditional lending institutions have a metrics of things that they look at, including track record. And I think that has caused some developers to be shut out of the access to capital process. And I think social housing has to, when it comes to funding social housing and thinking about including the kind of developers that are doing this work, we need to pay close attention to how we underwrite projects and underwrite developers. So these are just some suggestions on, I think, what I have learned on what does it take to advance social housing in a city with very complex regulations around housing, a city with very complicated politics around housing. One is we have to start acknowledging the fact that while we have a housing shortage and we have to think about ramping up our housing production meaningfully, we also have to think about preservation and protection and make sure that in the discussions that we have, in the policy making that we do, that we include the voices of groups that are focused on preservation. That we include the voices of renters and the most vulnerable residents in our city who are very concerned about tenant protection. So I think that is important to build bridges and alliances and actually allow policies, projects to move forward without much opposition. Second is reducing construction costs. Back to my point about we can increase funding for social housing, but if the overall construction costs remain to be high, we are not going to get a meaningful number of units out of our funding. So we have to find ways to reduce construction costs. One is through public lands. Land is one of the inputs of construction costs, and public land should be intended for public good. And policy reforms could result in lowering soft costs, simplifying the approval and permitting process, reducing the fees will help. And then finally, I think technology has a role to play in investing in innovative solutions that will bring down hard costs, modular construction, and other forms of technology that allows builders to look at building materials in innovative ways. One role that social housing can have state play, and I've seen this happen in healthcare, is if the city or even the state can form a housing agency that has access to economies of scale and is able to make purchasing decisions in bulk, I think that will help reduce construction costs because many developers are impacted by supply chain disruption. When prices of wood and steel go up, it oftentimes could make or kill a project. And having a state agency that has purchasing power and buying bulk materials to build social housing will be beneficial. And lastly, I'll just talk about the housing element process that most of the cities in California are currently going through. I think our state accountability unit are is really cracking down on cities that haven't really realistically planned for how we will meet our housing goals. And I think because of that, social housing could be a key tool for the city to say, we have to play a direct role in housing production, and this is how we do it through funding, policy reforms, and execution. And I want to end on an optimistic note because I'm excited about this amount of funding that we have managed to allocate here in San Francisco, almost $150 million of funding for social housing. The source of this funding is through certificate of participation, which is an alternative to municipal bonds. It is not the cheapest way to fund housing because, out of 146.8 million, about almost 35 million just to fund financing costs, but we have about $112 million for the city to be able to fund different social housing initiatives that focus on both production and preservation. And I'll end with some of the news articles that cover social housing initiatives that are gaining momentum across our country, from Seattle, which will be voting on the creation of a new social housing authority on the local ballot measure next year, to what's happening in Colorado, Hawaii, Maryland, and even here in California, where social housing continues to gain momentum, and there will be more activity on a state level in the coming years. And I'm optimistic that more local and state governments will realize that in order to confront the housing crisis, we not only need to make it easier, cheaper, faster to build, but we actually have to start thinking about having governments play a larger role in building the housing that we need. And that's the end of my presentation.
Wow. Well, thank you, Hans, for such a thorough and comprehensive and detailed presentation on not just social housing, not just the efforts that you've been involved with, but really an overview of many developments happening in California statewide. And, it gives a lot of hope to those of us in Hawaii who are digging our way out of a severe housing shortage here. The first question that I want to ask you is if you would mind sharing your presentation with the audience members who might be interested in digging a bit deeper.
Yeah.
We can, great, wonderful. We'll do that. And I see that some of our audience members have already been using our Q&A or chat features to ask questions. So we'll just dig right in. The first question is, do we have a market landscape analysis for social housing project development in Hawaii? And so obviously, Hans, you're not an expert here in Hawaii, but what kind of market landscape studies for social housing have been conducted in California?
I think when it comes to market landscape studies, they are done to identify first, what kinds of housing that are being underserved, and what is the gap in funding for those different kinds of housing that are being underserved. I think through the housing element process, I think the state has identified the housing goals for every region of the state, and we have also identified the housing shortage that we have and the amount of funding that we likely will get from the state over the next few years. And therein lies the gap in which where the state funding is not financing those projects, where if the state is projecting that the private sector is likely to reduce funding for housing over time, that's where I think social housing can come in. So I think there are studies being done on identifying the gap in financing based on the housing goals that we have determined for the state and for every region. But we haven't really gotten around how would we fill the gap in funding. I think that's why cities like San Francisco, is getting momentum in terms of pushing social housing as that solution to fill the gap.
Great. Our second question here is, what are the housing zoning policies in Hawaii when it comes to public housing development? And so, in California, you talked a little bit about production and about some of the bills that maybe we can talk more about later that allow, for example, commercial zones to be used for residential. Do you anticipate that large-scale social housing or public housing development would need zoning changes as well?
Yeah, I think before we even talk about zoning changes, we have to talk about voter approval. I think in the California Constitution, we have this provision called Article 34, which says that if the government wants to build public housing, low-income public housing, you have to go to the voters for approval. And I think that has created a lot of barriers historically for the government from being able to implement a public housing, a social housing program since the 1950s. I think it started as an initiative that says, every single neighborhood should have a say if the government wants to play a larger role in creating housing, and housing is seen as in any other infrastructure projects like streets and transit, and that it requires voter approval. I think so. Right now, there are efforts to repeal Article 34. And I think repealing Article 34 will be key to the state being able to build public housing at scale, which is one of the key tenets of social housing. I think that's one. I think the second thing about zoning changes, I think thanks to bills like AB 2011 that allows by right approval of affordable housing projects on commercially zoned lands. I think that's slowly making it easier for builders that want to build housing on commercial lands not to have to go through the process of changing the zoning, because we do have state laws that once passed and signed by the governor allow builders to build on commercial zones.
So just to clarify then, is Article 34 currently a barrier for the city's efforts to build housing that you talked about with Proposition K?
So Proposition K was passed as a short-term measure to allow the city to be able to at least build and operate up to 10,000 units. So Prop K only allows the city to be able to produce housing up to 10,000 units without going back to the voter. Obviously, what happens when we reach that 10,000 units? With this, the city would have to go back to voters for approval again, which is why I think, repealing Article 34 will not necessitate the need for something like Prop K to need to go to ballot again in the future if we do reach 10,000 units.
I see. So then if, for example, Assemblymember Lee's bill passes and there's a state social housing agency building in, say, Los Angeles, that agency would need to go to the voters of Los Angeles to seek approval for any new development in public housing?
Exactly. Which is why when SCA 2, which is the legislation to repeal Article 34, got passed out of the assembly, it was, it took a long time, but it was, widely celebrated. And right now, SCA 2 will be on the ballot in 2024. I think that will be key for any social housing efforts to be able to advance the local or state level.
Got it. Okay, so another one of our audience members wants to know about 3D printing as a potential solution for the high construction costs that we already talked about. Do you have any opinions on that or other new technologies?
Yeah, I think similar to modular construction, most of these technologies are still emerging, right? I think for 3D printing, I've seen interesting use cases for permanent supportive housing, or housing for currently or formerly homeless. And there's a, I think, company based out of Texas that's pioneering 3D printing for that segment of the market. However, I think it's not a technology or solution that is scalable in the US yet. I think that company that I was referencing, I think it's called Icon 3D. They scale their technology in other countries, South American countries that have, obviously large concentrations of poverty, where the government is desperate for immediate potential solutions that could be implemented. So I think there still needs to be some time to see how 3D printing will not only save time, but actually save costs and actually produce housing that is up to code. As we start to talk about multifamily housing, which is what social housing will hopefully produce, dense multifamily housing that can accommodate more units versus single family homes that 3D printing can produce. Once that happens, and if there's a proof of concept that 3D printing can facilitate construction of multifamily housing in a fast and cheaper way, then we'll see probably more implementation. But until that happens, I think it's still pretty early.
We've talked a lot about the policy changes that are coming down the pipeline and that are really quite extraordinary. But as a politician and having navigated the political system for sometimes very frustrating 4 years now as the housing chair here in the Hawaii State Senate, what was the political pathway that led to the Propositions I and K passage in San Francisco? Who were the leaders? What were the obstacles? And how long did it take to come to fruition?
Yeah, I think the politics of housing is extremely fraught in San Francisco right now, and it has only become more intense over time. I think even though there is sort of consensus on the need to produce more housing, there is no consensus on how we can go around doing that. And there's a lot of talk about what kind of housing we actually need and what kind of housing we should avoid. So, which is why I think Prop I and Prop K have been predominantly really pushed by pro-tenant activists and advocates who were really concerned about displacement and gentrification pressures in the city. However, I think over time, there has been a coalition of pro-tenant and pro-housing advocates, including YIMBYs, who acknowledge the fact that Article 34 has caused low-income public housing projects from being able to be constructed and contribute to housing supply. And I think there's a coalition of YIMBYs, pro-housing advocates, and pro-tenants advocates who are now coming together and say, something like Prop K was passed, I think, with more than 70% of the votes in San Francisco, because it was very popular to have a ballot measure that allows the city to be able to build. I think that's one. I think Prop I, though, is passed with a smaller majority. So I think that will continue to be the case when it comes to any ballot measures that intends to increase taxes in general. I think it's a little harder to or have a smaller majority to pass.
Yeah, that's no one wants their taxes raised. I'm sure that's true everywhere in the world. Yeah. So in your presentation, you mentioned several different strategies. You mentioned preservation, you mentioned production, you mentioned subsidies, you mentioned even an unsubsidized project that's very innovative. If you were to look on the broad scale, let's say we fast forward 50 years and now we're in the year 2072, and the headline on the Los Angeles Times or the San Francisco Chronicle is the housing shortage in California is now over. How would we have gotten there? And what would have been the relative importance of each of these strategies in terms of delivering the millions of units that are needed to actually end the housing shortage in California?
Yeah, I think social housing will have to play a huge role in that, in producing the very low and extremely low income housing that we need. Even though we are, pushing forward a mixed income social housing model, I think just historically, the private sector does a better job meeting middle income and above kind of housing. So, which is why I think it is important to have both the public sector and the private sector work in partnership to come up with the funding, as well as push for policy reforms that will facilitate housing production across all income levels. I think preservation, if we do housing production right, if we can get to a place where we are producing enough number of units of housing to serve our needs of all Californians, there should be less need and emphasis on preservation. I think, unfortunately, at this point in time, preservation strategies are still, extremely important and a key tool that our city has to hold on to, because while we wait for the thousands of units to be built and constructed and come in our pipeline, we have vulnerable renters who unfortunately are at risk of displacement. So my hope is that hopefully in the next, next decade or so, we can really ramp up housing production meaningfully, so that preservation doesn't need to be as big of a tool as it is now.
Got it. And so, as you know, there's a lot of stigma surrounding the term public housing in the United States.
Yeah.
I think when most people hear the term public housing, they think of concentration of poverty, they think of crime, they think of violence, they think of, the cyclical poverty that we've seen in a lot of the post-war era public housing construction in this country. I've put forward the argument that one way to overcome these problems, these social issues, is by the construction of income blind housing, but that's not the current policy that's being pursued in California. In what ways do you think that public housing round 2 would overcome, some of the obstacles that we saw very vividly with the post-war era public housing in this country?
Yeah, I think one thing is to go with a mixed income model, right? Like even though the average AMI of social housing program should be below or at 80% AMI, I think we have to come to the reality that we for that to happen, we should allow for a mix of income ranges. Above 80% AMI that will subsidize the lower AMI levels. I think that's one. I think second, we need to have a conversation about income restrictions over time, and I think it is a long conversation to have on once a tenant moves in, do we really want to create conditions in which the tenant would rather not increase his or her income so that they will continue to qualify to live in the unit that they're in. So I think, removing that income restriction, just like what Vienna has, where, once you move into a social housing unit, you don't have to stay within the income bracket to be able to stay in place. Having conversations about that and having, I think, affordable housing groups to have conversation about that and to be okay with that, I think will be key, because over time, there's just no way around not allowing higher AMI levels to subsidize the lower AMI levels for the program to be truly sustainable.
Got it. Yeah, and that is the example that we see in both Singapore and Vienna, where people of all AMI levels are permitted to live and to move into public housing. So
Yeah.
that seems to be consistent with those experiences. So feel free to continue to post questions in the Q&A of our Zoom. In the meantime, one consistent theme that we always talk about in this webinar is the phenomenon of NIMBYism, whether you want to call it, the not in my backyard phenomenon or place attachment. People do seem to have a very strong relationship to their physical surroundings, and any change to those physical surroundings can be very disruptive for people.
Mm-hmm.
If we are in fact talking about building not just thousands of units, but millions of units in California, how would you envision that the NIMBYism would be overcome? How would you help ensure that people are psychologically comfortable with such large scale changes to every town, every city, every county across this very large state of California?
Yeah, I think when it comes to NIMBYism, it's important to sort of distinguish where that comes from, because NIMBYism looks very differently in different neighborhoods in San Francisco. I think I mentioned earlier, the housing development in San Francisco is not concentrated in every single district in an equitable way. It's mostly concentrated in a few districts that have, neighborhoods that are predominantly communities of color who have fears of being displaced, and they have fears around gentrification. And when you have continues to have a pipeline of projects that go into those really dense and highly developed areas, you'll continue to see, affordable housing advocates who may oppose projects that have higher amount of market rate housing. I think that's sort of one sentiment I'm seeing. And then on the west side of San Francisco, and really in the rest of the suburbs around the Bay Area, even around Silicon Valley, where you have exclusive single-family neighborhoods, that's where the NIMBYism comes from. Homeowners who, like you said, is perhaps more resistant to change. I think one thing that there are a few things that I think need to happen, whether we like it or not, is change the way we think about discretionary review. I think discretionary review is a very powerful tool in California, especially here in San Francisco, for residents to be able to have a say in every single project, regardless of whether the project already meets the requirements or not. And I think there are more and more pro-housing legislators that are trying to stem the abuse of discretionary review from being used to kill affordable housing projects, especially if they come from single-family neighborhoods that simply have a harder time accepting that their neighborhoods have to accept more people and more housing. So I think policies that stem the abuse of discretionary review, as well as CEQA, will be important for more housing to be able to accept into those communities. If, other than policy, I think we need to continue to build alliances with pro-housing advocates who I think have done a great job in building a movement over the past few years to create the space for candidates who are running for office to be able to move closer and closer to where we need them to be on the pro-housing front. I think I see that very clearly in San Francisco and several other jurisdictions in California, where we are electing politicians at the local city council or at the assembly level, where legislators are becoming more pro-housing because NIMBY groups and other pro-housing groups are showing up in planning commission meetings. They are creating a movement where it is it is okay to say that you are pro-housing and you want more housing, and in fact, it is more acceptable to do that in San Francisco when it wasn't the case a few years ago. So I think continue to build that movement and make it easier and easier for candidates who are running in mostly single-family neighborhood districts to be able to slowly, over time, push for housing policies that will introduce more housing.
Well, our time is short, Hans, and unfortunately we can only take one more question. But you know, one of the things that gives me optimism here in the state of Hawaii is that we have a gubernatorial election coming up this fall, and there will be a new governor taking over from the term-limited incumbent. And this has the potential, I think, to shift the momentum in the conversation, because I think everyone in Hawaii would agree that housing is the #1 issue statewide. You saw that in California about 4 years ago when Governor Newsom took over. Do you think that when he took over that helped to change the political conversation? And are there any, if not, are there any specific moments of elections or of, just political headlines that did create the momentum to build the incredible progress that we've seen there?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to talk about housing in California without also talking about homelessness, which is a key issue for any, I think, politician who is in state or local office, because the homelessness issue is if not the most, one of the top most priority issues for voters in general. I think it's homelessness and public safety are the, I think, top 2 issues. So I think one of the key solutions to ending homelessness is to provide a pathway to getting the housing that our homeless neighbors need. So I think because of that, Governor Newsom and many other state officials who have to respond to the crisis of homelessness have to start looking at housing as a key tool to solving that. And that's how I think we have pro-housing movement that have gained steam over time.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Hans, for sharing such a deep and also wide-ranging perspective on the housing movements of California. I think we all have learned a great deal from your presentations and from the questions. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me here.
All right. Well, we hope you'll join us again for our next episode of Our Homes, which will be announced in the future. Thank you again for participating, everyone, and have a great day.